Okay, I see we have a few more people coming in. If you don't mind, you can put in the chat where you're tuning in from, and we'll just start in another minute. Also, if you would like, we do ask if you can turn on your cameras. If you're not able to, that's completely understandable though. Okay, I think we can start now. So hello everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. My name is Kaylee Ponder, and I am an international humanitarian law youth action campaign advocate representing the North Florida region. For this event, we will hear from youth delegates who will talk about their experience representing the American Red Cross in Indonesia. To start, I would like to give a little background on each of the three delegates. So with us today, we have Sarah Kokar, Tara Elsie, and Tejaswini Ramesh. So just give a little background. Sarah Kokar has been volunteering since 2021, and she is an international humanitarian law youth action campaign advocate. In the fall, she will attend the University of Houston and plans to study psychology, medicine, and society. Also, we have Cara Elsie, who has been volunteering since 2021 as well, and has worked in biomedical services, disaster cycle services, and service to the armed forces and international services. She is an international humanitarian law youth action campaign advocate and also serves as a coordinator for the program. She is also a youth preparedness presenter, and currently she is enrolled at Arizona State University and is studying history, justice studies, and sustainable food systems. And last but not least, we have Tejaswini Ramesh, who has been volunteering with the American Red Cross since 2019. She is an American Red Cross International Law Youth Delegate and a lead advocate mentor for the Northern California coastal region. In addition, she is an incoming economics and political science major at the University of California, Irvine. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And I will now pass it over to the delegates so they can share their experience with us. Thank you again.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Tejaswini, and thank you, Kaylee, for introducing us. Before we start, I just wanted to say that we're really grateful to be here and talk to all of you advocates and the rest of the audience here. The three of us were also part of Summit last year, so it's super cool to be back this year, this time as youth delegates, and hopefully we'll be able to share something that you will find insightful about our experience. So today we're going to talk about our experience as American Red Cross representatives, but specifically focus on how IHL YAC ties into our work there. But before we do that, we need to first talk about why we went to Indonesia in the first place, so you guys know sort of the context of what's going on. So I want to direct your attention to this word on the screen right here, Jembara. This is the name of Indonesia Red Cross's Youth Leadership Development Camp, which happens once every 5 years. We were one country among 11 national societies that participated in this camp, and it included around 4,000 participants total. The camp took place from July 2nd to July 10th, and as delegates, we basically had the opportunity to participate in a ton of activities, which were broken down into three major categories that I will explain right now. So the first category, Jumpa, translates into meeting, which looked like seminars and sessions related to topics that concern global issues today. So things like climate change, education, that sort of stuff. The second category, Bhakti, the second category basically means like service. So things like planting mangrove trees to help the environment or community service in local neighborhoods. Lastly, this third category, Jambira, means friendship. So there were fun sports activities and neighborhood visits that we could participate in. And if you look at the letters colored in white, you can see that when they all come together, they actually form the name of the camp, Jambara. So that's just a general overview of what this camp was about. Now I'll pass it over to Kara to get us started on a day-by-day breakdown of the overall experience.
Beanie, thank you so much. That was great. So for the first 2 days of the camp, the first day we were really just settling in, getting to know the PMI youth, getting to know the other international societies that were there. But on day 2, we went to a cultural parade. And for the cultural parade, each of the different provinces in Indonesia, there's 38 provinces, and there was 34 represented at Jumbara. Each of the Indonesian provinces and each of the Red Cross national societies had the opportunity to proudly display their national and provincial culture to the locals in Calienda, who were there cheering us on as we marched through the town, which was really, really cool to see. We're going to show a video of that in just a second. And each national society or province picked something unique about their culture to represent. So for our theme, we thought about this for a long time, but for the American Red Cross, we ended up deciding that we wanted to focus on how America is a melting pot, where there's such a diverse range of cultures, ethnicities, and religions that all coexist. And we really wanted to highlight that for our cultural parade. So Tejas, if you could play the short video on the next slide, you can see a little bit of what the cultural parade was like. So then for day 3, we went to the opening ceremony. That was on July 4th. And it was just a short distance away from the campsite. And it was open to a lot of people. There was tons and tons of people there. Tons of people from the local area. There was also people who had traveled from different parts of Indonesia to come to this opening ceremony. And it was similar in some ways to the cultural parade, that it was a time for us to celebrate unique traditions that Indonesian provinces have. And we saw a whole variety of performances. Like I said, there was 34 provinces that came, and they were celebrating the unique traditions that they had. And we were able to see that through a whole variety of performances and the distinct fashions of each province. If you look at the photo in the upper right-hand corner, you can see in a line the different provinces. They were all lined up. And then on the lower right-hand corner, you can see again kind of just the scope of the amount of people that were there. And so one representative, if you look at now in the lower left-hand corner, one representative from each province and each visiting country was chosen to greet the local and national governments to kind of kick off the 9th Jumbara. And so there is me and 3 other international delegates who were there helping kick off the 9th Jumbara, which was a really, really cool experience. And in the afternoon, after the cultural parade and after the opening ceremony, we had different sessions that we were able to go to. And Sarah is now going to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Kara. So yeah, one of the biggest ways we were able to connect with PMI youth and kind of learn the basic materials of PMI volunteerism was through these camp sessions. These sessions took place throughout the camp, and they kind of revolved around a variety of topics, but some of them are youth journalism, resilient youth, social entrepreneurship, community service. And these sessions brought together national and international delegates and participants. And through this, we were able to kind of share knowledge, and we were also just able to improve our skills through discussion and activity. So the sessions that we kind of attended the most revolved around youth journalism and resilient youth. And what was interesting about these sessions is that they were in Indonesian, but in a way that was kind of a positive, because it gave us the opportunity to collaborate with other national youth volunteers and PMI youth. And we kind of leaned on them for translation and guidance throughout the sessions. And through that, we were also able to just exchange stories and foster and develop ideas and create friendships. So the one thing we kind of learned in youth journalism, just to briefly summarize it, were things like technical skills needed in capturing images and writing articles for media promotion and publication, for things like newsletters and media posts. And then for the resilient youth sessions, we learned about the importance of physically taking care of yourself, not only physically, but also emotionally, so that when it comes to helping others and helping and aiding others, you are the best version of yourself, and therefore you can kind of take that best version of yourself and help others. And so after we attended these camp sessions, they kind of led up to this event called the International Youth Conference. And I am going to pass it off to Tejasvini to talk about that.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Kara and Sarah. Our next experience was at the International Youth Conference, as Sarah said, which was one of our biggest activities that we participated in at camp. So this was a full day event organized entirely by the international contingent, so us and the other 11 national societies that came. So we had 2 sessions in this event, and the end goal was essentially to publish a formal declaration that addressed the problems that PMI youth faced on a regular basis. So we wanted to write something that would help improve the Indonesian Red Cross's youth program to help the youth get more involved in the ways that they wanted to. So in session 1, each country presented their best practice youth program. So we would see countries present on their youth programs that would focus on different topics like climate change or COVID relief. We focused on our youth programs as a whole in the empowerment lens, and then focused on the IHL YAC program in the context of youth development. So we talked about how youth would uplift their communities and lead each other through events that they'd host. And you can see a couple of teams featured here. We talked about how, and we'll touch on this a bit more towards the end of the presentation, but we talked about how one of the biggest reasons as to why we chose to spotlight IHL YAC was to get more national societies to build an IHL YAC program in their country. So this was essentially our way of introducing them to this program and hopefully being able to kickstart a global youth empowerment initiative through IHL YAC. And now I'll pass it over to Kara to talk a little bit more about session 2.
Yeah, so during session 2, we really focused on listening to the youth volunteers speak on their individual involvement in the Red Cross and their province's involvement. So during session 2 of the International Youth Conference, I was a group facilitator, and there was a couple of group facilitators, and we had breakout groups of PMI youth, which PMI is the Indonesian Red Cross. I saw that question in the comment, but the Indonesian Red Cross youth, as well as youth from the different international societies. And we discussed their viewpoints on particular issues that are impacting Indonesia and the international societies that were there, and discuss what actions they would like to see from PMI and from the Red Cross generally, the different national societies. And so prominent themes that came up a lot were climate change, better disaster relief efforts, international humanitarian law, and expanded youth programs. And so after we did the breakout sessions, those of us that were group facilitators and the 2 lead facilitators went into what was called the drafting committee, and we worked on drafting the youth declaration for 2023. And so we took all of the ideas that had been discussed in the different groups and the different presentations that the groups had after the breakout groups were done. We took all those ideas, compiled them, summarized them, went in depth about what the youth would like to see. And we created the Youth Declaration of Calienda 2023, which Calienda was the name of the city that we were in. And so it's about 5 pages. We don't really have time to go in depth about it here, but if anyone is interested in reading the Youth Declaration, please email me. My email will be on the last slide, and I'm happy to send you a copy for you to review.
So the next thing that we did, well, actually not the next thing, but something that we did throughout the camp really was neighborhood visits. So each night, all of the international delegates would take part in these neighborhood visits where we would visit the campsites of each province. And this is really an eye-opening experience for us because we were able to see the beautifully decorated campsites of different provinces. We were also just able to informally interact with youth volunteers and international delegates. And through this, we were able to talk about the programs that we have within the American Red Cross, including the International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Program. And then we were also able to learn about each province's involvement with the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. So these neighborhood visits were very fun because we were able to see the different cultures and traditions of each province. And we were able to, in a way, take part in it by wearing traditional clothing and participating in traditional dances and trying traditional foods. If you look at this picture in the middle up at the top, that's one of our delegates wearing traditional clothing. And then the two pictures on the side here, the bigger ones, they kind of show just the extent that these provinces went into making their booths and their campsites just visually incredible and very beautiful. And it was really one of the most incredible ways to learn about each province's involvement with the Red Cross and Red Crescent, because we were able to directly talk with PMI youth and talk about what exactly, not only on a formal level, but really just how they themselves got involved with the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So it was really great. And being able to communicate with such a diverse group opened our eyes to the many experiences that youth go through when joining the Red Cross and the many programs that they have established. And it also just gave us a really great chance to talk about International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Campaign. And it was really great, and everybody was so welcoming. So really awesome. But yeah. So one of the last things we did in our trip to Indonesia was we traveled to a city called Jakarta, and we stayed there for 2 days. And there we talked about our programs within the American Red Cross. And we got to speak with an incredible organization called At America. And At America, for those of you that don't know, it's the US Embassy's American Culture Center. And they mainly work towards fostering discussion between Indonesians and Americans about issues that both Indonesians and Americans care about. And through that, they also host free events that are open to the public that include discussions on science and education and the environment. And so it was a really great opportunity for us, the American delegates, to talk about the programs within the American Red Cross. And we were also just able to really spotlight International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Campaign and spread awareness about that. So it was really incredible because it was giving us the opportunity to advocate and educate an audience on the amazing programs, and then just showcase their importance in developing youth and impacting the world around us. So that was really great. So if we could highlight, summarize this trip in 3 words, which is, just a glimpse of our experience on this trip, we would kind of describe it as insightful, collaborative, and inspiring. So the reason why we chose these three words was because insightful, really, we were just able to speak with so many different youth about their programs and about what they find interesting and what they're passionate about within their provinces and their journeys with the Red Cross. It was really just great to hear about that. It also allowed us to kind of advocate for the programs that we have. And that ultimately gave us a lot of interest in International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Campaign, which we'll talk about later. But it was really great to just be able to learn about that. It was incredibly collaborative. Like I mentioned with the neighborhood visits, and like Tejasvini and Kara mentioned with the International Youth Conference, those were incredible environments where we got to really just collaborate with different people in regards to the Red Cross. And it was also just incredibly inspiring, just being able to hear about everybody's journeys with the Red Cross, and seeing the enthusiasm and excitement that people carry towards it all. It was really amazing. So now we are going to talk about section 2, and this is introducing the International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Campaign program to youth specifically.
So the first thing that we wanted to kind of touch on was, why are we trying to introduce IHL to others? Why do we want to spread international humanitarian law? Why were we there doing this? Why did we feel this was important? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. So the first thing is that spreading international humanitarian law is part of the mission of the American Red Cross. So that alone would be enough for us to go and do it. But we're going to go into some really specific examples of why international humanitarian law is important and the tangible impacts that it's had on people around the world. So the first thing that we want to talk about is how the direct impact that IHL has on citizens. When they're aware of it, they're able to hold their governments accountable, and it puts pressure on the governments to actually follow through with their agreement to comply with international humanitarian law. So I wanted to talk about two specific examples of this, one having to do with a non-state armed group and one having to do with the Canadian government. So an example of the impact that international humanitarian law has had is during Canada's Operation Mobile in Libya. There was 2 Canadian pilots that aborted an authorized airstrike because while they were in the middle of what would become this airstrike, they realized that the collateral damage was higher than what would be considered acceptable for the principle of proportionality. And so they actually pulled back, aborted the airstrike. And so that's an example of when people are aware of international humanitarian law and when they know what these principles are, real lives are saved, and there's a real tangible impact that we can see when people know about international humanitarian law. Another example of positive things coming from international humanitarian law is non-state armed groups will often use IHL to try to gain public approval to be accepted as legitimate. So a specific example of this is from 2009. There was a non-state armed group in the Philippines that signed an action plan with the UN, agreeing that they would end recruitment of child soldiers, so any soldiers under the age of 18. And they also agreed to release and reintegrate all current child soldiers back into their respective communities. And so, again, these are direct impacts of how citizens in these countries were impacted and the positive effect that international humanitarian law can have when people are aware of international humanitarian law. Another reason that we want to spread awareness about IHL is that this is a legal framework that people who have been victims of violations of international humanitarian law can use to seek reconciliation and seek legal action for what has happened to them or perhaps what's happened to their families. And so there's sometimes pushback against the idea of international humanitarian law that, oh, this isn't always followed. Look at this example of this. IHL wasn't followed. Why should we do this? It doesn't get followed all the time, which is, of course, every law is not followed all of the time. But even when it's not followed, the legal framework of international humanitarian law is still important because it's what gives victims the framework that they need to seek reconciliation and to seek legal aid. Outside of just protecting civilians, there is also other facets of IHL that gain protection. So for example, the environment, biodiversity, cultural property, these are all things that are also protected by international humanitarian law. Looking at biodiversity specifically, a highly disproportionate amount of armed conflicts happen in biodiversity hotspots. And so that's something that is really important to look at the impact that international armed conflicts have on the environment, have on biodiversity, things like this. And spreading the awareness about international humanitarian law helps protect not just civilians, but also the environment, cultural property, all these different facets. So I just talked a little bit about cultural property, but I want to go a little bit more in depth with IHL and cultural property. People everywhere know the importance of cultural property. We don't need to go and tell people about cultural property. People who that's their culture, they understand and they know better than us the importance of this cultural property. But giving them the information about international humanitarian law helps give them this barrier for people who are trying to take their culture away, who are trying to interact with cultural cleansing, who want to destroy cultural property. And so it's really important to spread awareness about international humanitarian law so that people are able to use it to protect their cultural property and to protect their culture, because cultural property is a very tangible way that culture is passed down from generation to generation. And the last thing that we wanted to touch on was youth are generally just excited about IHL. They were excited to talk to us. They were excited about what we had to say. They came and spoke to us they gave us their email, they wanted more information, they were interested in this topic. And so just by how excited they are, it keeps them involved in humanitarian work and makes them more active global citizens, which makes them more involved in Red Cross efforts generally outside of just international humanitarian law. So Sarah is going to talk a little bit now about the response, how I just touched on, how excited the youth were to talk about this topic with us.
Thank you, Kara. So we had multiple opportunities to talk about the International Humanitarian Law Youth Action Campaign throughout camp, both formally during the International Youth Conference and informally through our discussions with other PMI youth and international delegates through the neighborhood visits or the exhibition booths. So what we noticed when we talked about international humanitarian law, and specifically just making it a spotlight among the presentations we did, was that there was an incredibly high interest from Indonesian youth. And it was very, I would say in my eyes, very overwhelming, because it was just an incredible thing to see so many people interested in international humanitarian law. So making it a focus among our presentations ultimately brought awareness, and that brought about interest from different youth that currently don't have international humanitarian law youth action campaigns and programs within their countries. And it was just really great to see that interest. So the importance of that interest is that kind of empowers youth to want to take action, and taking action on something that they're not super familiar with, but would like to get familiar with. And so that really just opens up a door for us specifically to bring about those programs to their respective areas. And that interest ultimately will empower youth to act in and participate in international humanitarian law programs. And so we kind of noticed the cycle of the more awareness we brought to IHL, the more interest we received, and the more youth that came up to us wanting to participate and really become involved in international humanitarian law. So it was really great to see that.
All right, so that was great. Thank you both, Kara and Sarah. Now that the camp is over, our presentation's starting to come to a close, you might be wondering, what's next? What do we do now that we've introduced IHL YAC to the rest of the world? We understand the importance of spreading awareness about it, as Kara just mentioned, and we understand that youth themselves enjoy this, as Sarah just mentioned. So what do we do now? The answer, to be honest, it's quite simple. We just expand. But we can't just give other countries this information and expect them to just follow through on it, right? We also have to be part of that effort. So our role now is to take the IHL YAC program to the next level, because when we do that, we're not only increasing awareness about IHL, we're also investing in our youth and our future. We're helping them bring change in their own country's laws, and we're also helping them cultivate strong youth-led communities with them, their friends, their local friends in their communities, and maybe even international friends, like ones we just made. But the point is, when we do all of that, we're able to create a strong community that will pave the way for a generation of global citizens in our future. And you guys are just as much of that effort as we are. So that's what we're going to leave you with for this afternoon. Thank you all so much for your time today. I'll now pass it back to Patrick and Kaylee to facilitate the remainder of this event.
Delegates, thank you again for the presentation. So yeah, now we can open the floor for questions if anyone has any. You can either come off mute, raise your hand, or put your question in the chat if you'd like.
I have a question. So I know there was at this camp, there was like a few like IHL sponsored events like led by like sort of the camp. And I wanted to ask if you guys saw any like similarities or differences about how like IHL was introduced, maybe like through that camp, and then how you guys would teach IHL like back home, if there's any like similarities or differences about how like the story of IHL was told.
Yeah, sure. I can start off on that one. So it's a great question. To be honest, I think that American Red Cross was sort of the only one that focused on the IHL YAC program. All the other national societies, they tended to focus more on disaster relief efforts. We saw a lot of presentations on climate change, some on youth development, but even those programs focused on disaster relief. So how youth were involved in disaster related programs. So we didn't really see much of an exposure that youth had, international youth had to the IHL YAC program. So I think, to be honest, the most exposure they had to international humanitarian law were the orientation sessions that they experienced at the camp. So at camp, we had orientations for international humanitarian law. I would say that was a big part of it. And then the second part was probably the way we talked about it at International Youth Conference. So I believe that's probably the most involvement they've had. So I wouldn't say that they have much similarities in terms of the way they teach it. In terms of the orientation, it was definitely more lecture style, where we tend to be more interactive with the events and things that we have. So I would say that there are probably differences in the way that they teach international humanitarian law. But overall, just focusing on the amount of exposure they have, I would say that they probably focus less compared to the amount of focus that we have. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. And Kara, Sarah, Asara, if you want to add anything else, feel free.
I think what you said was a really great description.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And in a way, because IHL, other countries had focused on other topics, and we were kind of one of the only countries that really had a spotlight on international humanitarian law. It really just led to the overall overwhelming interest that youth had. And so in a way, it was just really great, because even though IHL wasn't necessarily a huge focus, because we made it such a big spotlight, so many youth were interested. And it was just really great to see.
And Johnny, you can go with your question.
All right, so why would you say it's important specifically for youth to be involved and advocate for programs and campaigns like this?
So I can talk a little bit about that. So obviously on my slide, I went kind of in depth about the different reasons why international humanitarian law is important. So I'm not going to reiterate this, but I think youth specifically getting involved in something like this is important, because it's a way for youth to develop their leadership skills. And as we all know, I went through YAC, I know that this is a focus. We're the next generation of leaders, right? And so we want youth to be developing their leadership skills. And I think that especially something like this, international humanitarian law, that is not always the most well-known topic, for youth to go out and lead the conversation on this. It's interesting, it's engaging, and it empowers youth to go out and have conversations about other topics that they're passionate about. So I would definitely say that from a youth development angle, the IHL YAC program is extremely important. And like I said, I already touched on why IHL as a point of content is important. So.
And I actually had a question regarding the cultural parade. What other cultures did you guys observe, and what themes really stuck out to you?
I can start off on this one. So in the cultural parade, we walked with all the Indonesian provinces that showed up, and we also walked with the 11 other national societies that came. So we observed a lot of different cultures, to be honest. If I had to explain each and every single one, we'd probably be here for a while. So I'll just say that the thing that struck out most to me was the fashion and the clothing that people were wearing, because it was so grand and regal. I think if you looked, you might have been able to see a couple of outfits in the video. I don't know if you were able to see because it was a little short, but they had lots of regal headpieces and just garments that were very beautifully handmade, embroidered. And I think just looking at how there was such a diversity in terms of the cultures that were there just within the Indonesian provinces. I think that was really cool to see.
And I guess another question, how would people be able to participate in this program? And like, were there some requirements? Just for anyone who's in on the call who may be interested in potentially doing something like this in the future.
Sure, I can start off with this one. So the way we heard about, just to clarify your question, are you asking how did we get the opportunity to go to Indonesia?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So we actually heard about it through Larissa, who is on this call. We just got a call from her saying that this program was open, and I thought it was an incredible opportunity, so I said yes, and that's sort of how I got involved with the Indonesia program.
I'm sorry, ladies. I was trying to get off mute, or not mute, raise my hand, and then I realized I couldn't as a host. I want to share or emphasize what Tejasvini said. You know, I reached out to these 3 delegates and a few others because of who they showed up for already for the Red Cross. So there's different processes. There's lots of different opportunities out there. You all have them in your local regions. There's a lot of you on this call that are advocates in the summit program this year. There's a lot of you that are advocates that are maybe just learning about these things and want to get more involved next year. But as all 3 of our delegates kind of emphasized in their different parts of the presentation, it's because of who they are in this program and their passion for not even just IHL, but to further the Red Cross mission, that they were selected for it. So the reason I wanted to kind of share or emphasize or elaborate a little bit on what Tejasvini said was, the more that you do, the more that you show, the more that we are able to see your strengths and opportunities that we have, we're going to share them with all of you. This one was very unique, and as I think Kara said, it's every 5 years. So keep working hard, and hopefully you'll all have different opportunities like this, whether it's going to Indonesia or doing something where you get to represent the Red Cross in different ways. Thanks, Tejasvini. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit.
And Robert, you can go with your question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Robert from New York. I'm the new team lead for IHL in New York City. It's a big area, probably the biggest in the country. And I'm going to be working with YAC. So it's going to be a new experience. I was a teacher many years ago, but I find that the people who are in YAC are very, very motivated. So I basically have 2 questions. Number one, how did this experience in Indonesia maybe change your trajectory in university and professional school? I'm assuming that you had an idea of what you wanted to do before you went away. Obviously, anybody who works in YAC and is involved in IHL generally has an idea of what they want to do, but did this change anything you want to do, or maybe reinforce what you had already planned? And the second thing is, as young people, what draws you to want to get involved in IHL, particularly if we have in New York City monthly opportunities to meet online, teach classes, and have guest speakers? And maybe what kind of guest speakers in your age group would you like to see in a monthly program? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that. So I am in university and I have an idea of what I want to do, but I think that this experience really reinforced to me the importance of humanitarian work and the work that the Red Cross does, specifically the IHL program, because we have talked a little bit on this call about, you know, it's not always the most well-known topic, but when you kind of start working in IHL YAC or just in IHL generally, you kind of get used to it and you're like, oh, I do all this stuff all the time. I go out and I do stuff, but going to where we were and seeing, there's no program for this here, seeing the interest just reinforced that there's so much work to be done, and the American Red Cross really can lead the progress that's going to happen in the IHL space, because we have the facilities, we have the capability to do it, we have people who are passionate about it, and we can be the leaders in this space that this space really needs, because there's not a lot of people doing it. And so I think going really reinforced to me that this is a space that I want to be in, and this is something that I want to keep doing. And even though I'll age out of the Youth Action Campaign program, continuing to be involved in IHL as I get older is something that I'm really passionate about. And I think that that was definitely just reinforced by going on this trip.
Yeah, and I can add on, I think going on this trip for me, an idea that was kind of introduced to me, obviously, taking part in the IHL Youth Action Campaign, it's something that, all of us have a passion for. But going on this trip, it ultimately made me realize the importance of spreading that to audiences that may not necessarily have an idea of what international humanitarian law is. And, we talked about in this presentation how much interest we received in this topic, and it was just really eye-opening, because it showed that with the proper efforts made in making people aware of IHL, that there will always be a group interested, a group that wants to learn more, a group that wants to participate in this program and ultimately make a difference in that way. So it definitely reinforced that idea for me.
And Latifa, you can go with your question.
Yeah, I have a question. This is just kind of like a question that I'm like curious about, but were you guys able to kind of tour like the attraction spots in Indonesia, or were you guys just kind of like in little provinces, or just like in your camp areas?
Sure, I can start off with that one. So we were like kind of busy every single day throughout this camp, so we didn't really get a chance to tour that much. We went to a couple of beaches, but that was kind of it. We just sort of walked around like the provinces that were at camp. And then when we got to Jakarta, we got to do a little just walk around the city, but that was kind of it in terms of like tourism. So it was pretty just like work heavy, and then just hanging around while we were at camp.
Thank you for that.
The question I have is, I think this was touched on a little bit earlier, but just for like some clarification for my sake, how was Indonesia chosen exactly?
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat your question? I think you cut off for me a little bit.
Oh, sorry. My question was just, how and I guess why was Indonesia chosen? Like for you guys to travel to.
Ooh, okay. So why was Indonesia like the chosen destination for us?
Yes.
Okay. So I think because the Red Cross in Indonesia, the Indonesian Red Cross, it's a huge thing, and that's kind of something that I didn't really recognize until I had reached Indonesia, just how big and how affiliated the Red Cross was within the country and within the government. So it was very obviously the American Red Cross is huge over here in the States, but over there it was big on a different level, in a different way. And I think part of the reason why we were chosen, or the location for the camp, is because Indonesia has hosted the camp for every 5 years they host this camp. And so 2023 was, I guess, the new date for them to be hosting the camp. And so it was really great to go and take part in that. And it was great because we were just all able to speak with so many Indonesian youth and PMI volunteers. And yeah, it's great.
Thank you. And Latifa, you can go with your question.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of a question in general, but do you guys know why it's kind of like a 5-year program, like every 5 years you get to go kind of thing?
So there's actually two different versions of this event. There's a youth event, which is what we were at, and then there's an adult event, and both are hosted every 5 years. And I did ask our translator why it wasn't an annual event, because at first when I read it, my understanding was that it was an annual event, and her understanding of why it's every 5 years is just the amount of work that it takes to put this event on. There's a lot of international societies that come. There was 26 that were invited, and there were 11 that ended up attending. And there's a lot of work that has to be done in the area that it's hosted. So it moves around between the different islands and between different cities. This was the first time that it was hosted in Lampung province, the city of Caliendo specifically. And there's just a ton of work that goes into this. It's a big time investment. It's a lot of money to put this event on. And so that was her understanding of why it happens every 5 years. And also there's the adult partner version of this event that happens every 5 years as well. So really there's an event happening more than every 5 years. There's just two different versions of it.
Got it. Thank you for the clarification.
And Johnny, you can go.
So you talked about how big the Red Cross is. Did you find that there was any other programs like the Youth Action Campaign?
I can talk a little bit about this. So during the group discussions that happened during session 2 of the International Youth Conference, I got to talk to a lot of PMI youth, and they really mentioned that blood and the whole, sort of like the blood program, that's pretty big in Indonesia. But they also have lots of other programs. And one thing that one of the girls mentioned to me that I thought was pretty interesting is that a lot of people have this stigma around Indonesia or Indonesian Red Cross, saying that all they do is give out like blood and just do like medical stuff, even though they do so many other things. And so that was one thing that I thought was really interesting, because I don't know if those kinds of things exist with the American Red Cross, but it was interesting to hear that perspective come from someone who's involved with PMI. So I would say that is one program that they do that's kind of big, but I do also want to mention that they do things on the side.
Thank you.
I guess another question I had was, what kind of skills do you guys think you gained from this? I know this was kind of touched on a little bit throughout the presentation, but was there anything in particular that you think can kind of carry over into like your professional life, like careers down the road?
Yeah, I can definitely start this one off. I think a very surprising role that us American delegates had when we entered the camp was just communication. We talked a lot throughout our camp experience, not only with other international delegates, but PMI youth as well. And each conversation I had was just incredibly inspiring. It was really amazing to just hear the passion that people had towards their programs within their countries in regards to the Red Cross. And so I think a skill that I definitely took away was being able to continue and have a meaningful conversation. And I feel like that kind of translates into your professional life, because in your professional life, it's important to be able to carry these conversations. And it really was no effort in carrying these conversations, because they were just so, there were such exciting conversations to be had. But yeah, so definitely communication skills is something I've personally evolved on this trip.
Thank you. Does anyone have any final questions or any last minute thoughts? Okay, Well, I just want to say thank you, delegates, so much for sharing your experience of being able to go to Indonesia and represent the American Red Cross. The event was very informative. I know our audience really took something from it. So thank you again. And just to close, I want to remind the audience that we have 2 events for tomorrow. We have the Paper Cranes for Hope event from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern time. And following that event, we have the Dead Clothing and Sustainability event from 5 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, if anyone would like to become a Youth Action Campaign advocate, just send an email to ihlyouth@redcross.org, and I'm putting it in the chat now. Okay, it should be there. But yeah, and also Larissa has we'll put the links in the chat for the registration, so you can register. But yeah, thank you again for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.